Hi everybody, thank you so much for all of your interest and support on my 1-ingredient meat curing video. I have been absolutely blown away by the response to that video. I had not anticipated that many views, and you guys have had some amazing questions. So I wanted to take this opportunity to really in-depth answer some of the most asked questions on my meat curing video so far. Let's get started with the meat itself. Now, something that I kind of took for granted is quality. I am blessed to have grown up hunting and raising our own meat, at least partially. I've been very exposed to that from a young age, and I knew right off that quality was going to be important because the meat that we often find in the supermarkets, by the time it gets to us, it's been processed and maybe handled in not the best manner. It's been exposed to all kinds of things. Then it's been put in an airtight environment to just kind of sit and stew in whatever bacterial contamination it's been exposed to. And it's been sitting on shelves for who knows how long. It is already on the verge of spoilage by the time it gets to the consumer. I do not advise doing this method of preservation with the cheapest meat you can find at Walmart. I really suggest that you invest a little bit into quality at the start because that will provide you a much more quality product in the end. So if you're raising your own meat, if you're hunting and raising your animals, that's amazing. If you're not at that level, you can still totally do this, but search out a local farmer or a local homesteader who can supply meat to you, or go to a local butcher shop and talk to them about what kind of cuts you're looking for. Talk to them about their handling practices and get a fresh cut if possible. Frozen will totally work, but just do be aware that the quality you start with will affect your end product quality. All right, let's talk a little bit more about salt. I stressed the importance of a pure salt, and that got a little confusing because what I was meaning to say is that the only ingredient should be salt. Not that your salt can't have impurities and natural minerals. Any natural salt that it just comes from the earth the way God made it is going to be fine. We want to avoid iodized salt that has had iodine added to it. If it's a natural salt like Redmond's real salt has iodine in it, and that is great salt. That's fantastic. Avoid the salts that have been stripped of all their minerals and then had things added back to them. So nothing that has had iodine added and nothing that has anti-caking agents. We want to totally avoid all the anti-caking agents. So if you're shopping for salt, just look for something that only has one ingredient on the back. Redmond's real salt is amazing. I've linked Azure Standard before. They have a lot of wonderful salts. They do have some with anti-caking agents. So just take a look at the ingredients label. Kosher salts are great. And then that brings me to the second point that has been brought up on salt. The salt I'm using in the videos. It looks like a powder. Do you need to have salt that is that fine for this project? Absolutely not. In fact, I don't recommend it. A while back, I may have panic purchased salt when my regular salt was out of stock. I did not want to go into the winter season without a good supply of salt in my pantry because I think it is the number one pantry prep personally. For me, it's my number one, I have to have salt. So when my regular salt was out of stock, I went ahead and purchased the same thing in a different grind. It's called Velvet Grind, and it is very, very fine indeed. And it works just fine. It works great, but it is really easy to over salt with the Velvet Grind. I really recommend using a fine or medium fine grind salt. That's my preference, and that's what I would recommend to you. A really thick, rock salt, a coarse ground salt, is also not a good option because you won't get a very even coating and you can end up with an uneven cure. Some spots might not have enough salt and be undercured. Some spots will be more condensed and too salty. So very fine, I wouldn't recommend. Very coarse, I would say no. You really want a fine or medium fine grind salt. That's just the sweet spot. Now, rancidity and putrefaction. So, rancidity is not the same as putrefaction. Putrid meat is meat that is rotting, meat that is decaying. You would not want to eat it. It is spoiled. Now, rancidity is a type of spoilage It's a totally edible thing though. Your fat will eventually rancidify if you're storing these meats for long periods of time. That does not mean they're inedible. You can absolutely eat it if the fat has gone rancid. That is not a problem. Not everybody likes that flavor. It can have a bitter afternote, but that is also easily solved by putting it in a pot of beans or something like that, cooking it in a way that helps to bring out that rancid flavor. If your meat has become putrid, you will be able to tell. It will smell terrible. It might be wet and slimy. It will not be appetizing at all. You will not want to eat it. It will warn you away. It is very obvious when a whole muscle cure has gone bad. It is not so obvious in things like salamis. Those can be a little trickier to discern if they are okay to eat or not. But whole muscle cures, that's another great thing that makes them really beginner friendly. It's obvious when things have gone wrong. So if your cure is dry to the touch, it's not dripping, oozing, smelly goo, it's dry, the meat is firm, it smells nice, it's probably perfect. If it is squishy, if it is wet, if it is dripping all over the place, if it smells terrible, you should probably discard it. I would not eat that. What exactly is a whole muscle? That's a great question. If you've never participated in the harvest of an animal, I can definitely see where you would not know what a whole muscle is. If you have processed an animal, it makes it pretty obvious. You can see really clearly how things are put together and distinct muscle groups. It just makes it a lot more obvious. But I wanted to give you guys a couple examples to hopefully help clear that up. And again, if you talk to your local butcher, tell them what you're trying to do and ask for cut recommendations, I'm almost certain most of them would be delighted to help you find what will suit your needs. So whole muscle, let's think a whole loin, for example, an entire loin versus pork chops. That would be a whole muscle versus the cut up pieces, right? Same piece of the animal, but two really different preparations. Or a belly, a pork belly versus sliced up bacon. The same piece of the animal, but in different preparations. One's been cut up into little pieces already, and one is the whole big chunk. Whole muscle also excludes ground meat. I did get a couple questions on if this method is applicable for ground meat. Absolutely not. Ground meats can be turned into sausages and other preparations, but this is not an appropriate method for preserving ground meat. Whole muscles only, so larger pieces that have not been cut up into little tiny portions or have not been ground. How do you do this in a perpetually hot and or humid climate? That's a great question. I personally do not have any experience with that. I live in a very cool climate most of the time. We do have hot summers, but they're very short-lived, so I take advantage of my naturally cool season to start all of my cures. If you live somewhere that is perpetually warm and very humid, you can do a couple different things based on what I found out from reading up on it. Again, I have no personal experience with this, but from what I've read, what you would do to combat those situations is you would use more salt. So you might need to do a second round of salting, do the one coat of salt, let it rest 5 days, do another coat, which is something that I do for larger cuts of meat anyway. You're gonna want to salt and keep repeating that salt and rest process until you're not seeing the liquid come out. Another thing that you could use to help just get your cure jump started, help it dry out a little bit initially, is to utilize cold smoke. Cold smoke is just a delicious addition anyway, but it's also practical as it helps to dry the surface and just kind of get that drying process started. Especially if you're in somewhere warm and you have a lot of bugs, that smoking will keep the bugs off of it while it goes through its initial drying phase. And once the surface is dried a bit, it's much less appealing to bugs. You have a lot less problem keeping the flies off after that little initial drying phase. A specific type of cure you might want to look into if you are in one of these warm climates is biltong. It's a traditional South African preparation and it utilizes warm weather for its curing. If I want to make biltong, I need to either wait until my short summer season or I actually have to utilize my oven to dry it out. It's a little bit more like jerky, but not, I mean, you can dry it out to the point of jerky. You can dry it completely and it'll store for a couple years, or you can semi-dry it, which is my preference, and it stores at room temperature for a few months, and it's very delicious. I am gonna be working on my own version of biltong and posting a recipe for that soon, if you wanna see that. Depending on your level of commitment, and if you really have your heart set on making cures that your climate doesn't really support, you could invest in building a curing chamber. I have not done that. I don't know all the details on it. There's a ton of great videos. If you Google how to DIY a curing chamber, you'll find lots of people who have done it and have great resources on that. It is a lot more investment, but if you, again, have your heart set on making something in particular that your climate just doesn't really support, that is an option. I personally have my heart set on an old-fashioned root cellar someday where I will be able to store my meats, garden goodies, fermented veggies, and canned goods. That is my dream. I would love to have one. I absolutely fell in love with cellars when I had visited Europe. And yeah, that's my plan long term. I think that would be the ideal place to store my meats. And when I do that someday, be sure that I will post it so you guys can all see the whole process and how it ends up working. Another point of confusion, which was just a slip of the tongue on my part, and I'm sorry for that misunderstanding, I used the terms refrigerator and cold storage interchangeably. I should have been more specific, and I'm sorry for that. You can absolutely use the refrigerator if that is the only place that you have that is cool enough, or your only pest-free place to start your cures. Maybe you don't have a garage that stays cool and doesn't have mice, or maybe you don't have a cold pantry like I do where you can set something for a few days. Maybe you need to use the refrigerator. That's fine. You can absolutely use the refrigerator to get your cures started, but you don't have to use the refrigerator. You can absolutely use a garage, a basement, a cold back room, anywhere in your house that is going to be pest-free, where you can place your meat to sit for your 5 days or more if needed, where it will stay about 40 degrees to 50 degrees during that initial curing process. After it has gone through its initial cure, you've rinsed it, you've smoked it if you want to, or you just rinsed it and hung it up. You're gonna hang it somewhere cool to start with. So you set it in your salt, it rests for 5 days, you rinse it off, you put it somewhere cool again, maybe back in that same location. After it's had about 10 days to 2 weeks in that cool spot, then it can move to a room temperature location if you wish. Just keep in mind your storage location conditions are going to affect its long-term storage quality. It'll absolutely store at room temperature in sunlight, but your fat can go rancid faster in sunlight. It will go rancid faster in sunlight, and also it'll dry out faster at warmer temperatures. That doesn't mean it's going to be inedible. It just means the long-term storage quality will decrease with the less optimal conditions that you provide. Which brings me to the next point. How do you keep it from drying out too much? And is vacuum sealing a good option? Well, let's start with how do you keep it from drying out too much? Providing the optimal conditions would be one way to just really prolong its optimal condition in long-term storage. So a cool spot out of sunlight where it has 60 to 80% humidity and good airflow. That would be ideal, which is why I'm thinking a root cellar with a good ventilation system sounds like it would be an ideal location. The fat content in your meat is also going to play a huge role in how long it stays tender. Every breed, every animal, they're all different. So no two pieces are going to be exactly the same, which makes this a little bit more of an art than an exact science. You have to learn to see those differences and also just accept that every cure is going to be one of a kind. Things with higher fat content will stay supple much longer than very lean cuts. A loin will dry out extremely fast compared to a really well marbled copa muscle. So on to vacuum sealing. Is vacuum sealing a good way to keep the meat from drying out too much? I don't think so. From what I understand, again, I've not done this personally, but I did some research on it for you guys. The problem with vacuum sealing is the moisture content. So you can absolutely vacuum seal jerky. And if you want to take a cured meat, pre-slice it, dry it completely so that it is like a jerky, then you could absolutely vacuum seal it and stick it on your shelf, and it should be good for a long, long, long time. However, if it is still moist, you could have some problems by creating an anaerobic environment while it is still moist. So the advice that I got when I was looking into this was that if you want to vacuum seal your cured meats, you should freeze them afterwards, unless they are, like I said, very completely dried out. Now, what do you do with it when it's too dry? I mentioned grating, and I get that's not really a practical way to consume a lot of the meats. I should have also mentioned that it makes an incredible pot of beans. It makes a great addition to pastas, to quiches. Really, it's a great addition to so many things. If it's too brittle and it's not slicing well, or it's no longer an enjoyable texture to have sliced and fried or sliced raw, then what you can do is you can cube it up, you can soak it overnight even, you can simmer it all day, nice and slow, like a ham, and it will rehydrate and be wonderful in so many dishes. What if you're allergic to penicillin? That's a great question. So I actually am allergic to the antibiotic penicillin, but I am not allergic to the mold penicillin. And I did a little more research on this to just confirm what I had already thought. And indeed, the antibiotic penicillin is not the same thing as the naturally occurring mold. Some people are allergic to both, but not everybody is allergic to both. So if you can eat blue cheeses without having any reactions, then the naturally occurring molds on salamis and these other naturally cured dried aged meats are probably going to be just fine. If you have a bad reaction to blue cheese, you might have a similar reaction. And what you can do then is take a cloth with some raw apple cider vinegar on it and wipe down the outside of your meats before you eat them, or even periodically, just to keep that mold growth in check. Thank you all so much for joining me here. I hope I answered some of your questions. Again, I'm just sharing my personal experiences and the things that I personally do. I have linked some great resources in the description if you want a book for reference, or some other people that I have really found great information from over the years. I will link that in the description. Thank you again so much for following along, and have a wonderful day.